There is a specific quiet form of disappearing that has nothing to do with leaving a room and everything to do with what happens to your perceived weight in the room when you are always in it. When you are perpetually available, perpetually responsive, perpetually present in the specific way of someone who has never once made the people around them reckon with what it would mean if you were not. You have been told that being accessible is a virtue, that showing up is the work, that the person who is always there for the people in their life is demonstrating a quality of character worth having. And some version of that is true. But what is also true? What the psychology of perceived value and relational dynamics establishes with a precision that no amount of warmth or generosity can reverse, is that the person who is always available has communicated something very specific about their own value through that availability, something that operates below the conscious awareness of the people receiving the access, and below the conscious awareness of the person providing it, but that shapes with extraordinary reliability how much weight, how much consideration, how much genuine investment those people direct toward the person they can always reach. The invisibility that comes from being too accessible is not the invisibility of absence. It is the invisibility of furniture, the specific way that things which are always present cease to be noticed, cease to require attention, cease to generate the specific cognitive and emotional engagement that scarce and selectively available things reliably generate. You are there every time they look. And because you are there every time they look, they have stopped looking with the quality of attention that your presence would produce if there were any uncertainty about whether it would be there at all. What has happened is not that you have been devalued because you are not worthy of value. What has happened is that the signal that communicates value in every human relational system, the signal of scarcity, of selective availability, of genuine cost to access, has been absent from the way you have been showing up, and the relational system, operating with the automatic and undiscriminating efficiency of any value assessment mechanism, has assigned you the value that your accessibility signal warrants, rather than the value that you actually carry. Today on Quiet Power, we go to the precise psychological architecture of this dynamic, why constant accessibility creates invisibility rather than intimacy, what the specific mechanisms are through which perceived value operates in human relationships, and what the difference is between the selective availability that this video will describe and the strategic withholding that produces only resentment and distance. This is Quiet Power, where we go to the actual psychological architecture of the social dynamics that most people navigate entirely on instinct and received advice, neither of which have ever fully explained the specific experience this video is describing. What you are about to understand will reorganize how you think about your own presence in every significant relationship you inhabit, not by telling you to be less generous, or less caring, or less genuinely available to the people who matter to you, but by giving you the precise understanding of why how you are available matters as much as whether you are available. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this channel is building the most complete map available of the psychological territory that shapes how you are perceived and how you relate, and this video is one of its most personally significant pieces. The first thing to understand about why being too accessible creates invisibility is what perceived value actually is in the context of human relationships. Not what we wish it were, not what the narrative of unconditional love and genuine connection says it should be, but what it actually is as a psychological mechanism, operating below the threshold of conscious deliberation and organizing the attention, the investment, and the relational engagement of every person in your social environment in ways that the explicit values of those people would often disavow if they were asked about them. Perceived value in human relationships is not primarily determined by the intrinsic qualities of the person being valued, their character, their intelligence, their warmth, their genuine contribution to the lives of the people around them. It is determined by a set of social signals that the human value assessment system has been calibrated by evolution to read automatically, and to use as proxies for the underlying qualities they correlate with, in exactly the way that the economic value assessment system uses market signals, price, scarcity, demand, as proxies for underlying quality in ways that are systematically disconnected from intrinsic merit and systematically reliable as predictors of how other people will respond to the thing being valued. The most powerful of these social value signals is scarcity, and its psychological operation in human relationships is the one that Robert Cialdini's landmark research on influence identified as one of the most robust and most consistently replicated findings in social psychology: the specific tendency of human beings to assign higher value to things that are less available, and to reduce their valuation of things as those things become more consistently available, not because the underlying qualities have changed, but because the availability signal has changed the perception of those underlying qualities in the automatic, pre-deliberate value assessment system that processes the signal. When applied to human presence and accessibility in relationships, this principle produces the specific dynamic that this video is named for. The person who is always accessible has provided the social environment with a continuous signal of their availability, and the value assessment system has processed that signal in the automatic direction of reduced perceived scarcity, which means reduced perceived value, regardless of what the person's actual worth is. The relationship between accessibility and perceived value is not proportional in the direction that generosity would suggest it should be. It is inverted in the specific way that the scarcity principle predicts. More availability signals less value, and the person who provides the most consistent access is, by the automatic logic of the value assessment system, communicating the lowest value signal available within the relationship. The research on relationship dynamics and investment patterns, drawing from the equity theory of atoms and the social exchange framework of Blau, establishes a related mechanism. The value that people assign to a relationship resource, including the time, attention, and presence of another person, is calibrated not only to its intrinsic quality, but to its relative scarcity within the relational economy. And the person who makes their time and presence freely and consistently available has reduced the scarcity of those resources to zero within their relational economy, which is precisely the condition that produces the invisibility that this video is describing. This is not a judgment about the generosity of the accessible person, or about the coldness of the people around them who are responding to the accessibility signal in the way the value assessment system calibrates them to respond. It is a description of how the system works, operating with the same indifferent reliability in human relationships that the economic price mechanism operates within markets. Not because anyone has decided that this is how value should work, but because this is how the system, operating at the level of automatic social cognition, does work. And it works this way consistently across cultures, across relationship types, and across the full range of individual differences in the explicit values and stated commitments of the people inside the relationships it is shaping. The second layer maps the specific mechanisms through which excessive accessibility produces the invisibility experience, the particular psychological and relational processes that translate the abstract principle of scarcity and perceived value into the lived experience of the person who is too accessible. The specific feeling of being overlooked, of being taken for granted, of having your presence register at a lower level of attention and engagement than you know yourself to be worth, of being the person who is always consulted, but never the one people are most excited to reach, of showing up consistently and finding that the consistency itself has somehow made you less rather than more significant in the lives of the people you are. Consistently showing up for. The first mechanism is the habituation effect, one of the most fundamental and most thoroughly documented phenomena in all of perception and psychology. The specific and automatic reduction in the neural response to any stimulus that is presented with sufficient frequency and consistency. The human nervous system is not designed to maintain the same level of engagement with any stimulus indefinitely. It is designed to detect change and novelty as signals of potential relevance and to reduce its engagement with stable, consistent, predictable stimuli as signals of the absence of relevant change. When your presence in someone's life is consistently available, when you are always reachable, always responsive, always there when they reach, you have become, from the perspective of their nervous system's relevance detection system, a stable background condition of their relational environment rather than a figure against that background. You are not registering as an event, not generating the specific neural engagement that events generate, not producing the attention and the investment that novelty and uncertainty produce. You are furniture in the room of their relational life, present, functional, providing the specific value that furniture provides, and noticed with exactly the same quality of attention that furniture receives, which is to say, not noticed at all unless it breaks or disappears. The second mechanism is the expectation ratchet, the specific process by which the consistent provision of a resource at a particular level creates an expectation of that level as the baseline and reframes any reduction of the resource from the baseline as a loss requiring explanation or remedy, while producing no positive response to the maintenance of the baseline because maintenance of an expectation produces no net value in the relational account. The person who is always accessible has, through their consistency, installed themselves as a baseline expectation in the relational account of the people around them. Their presence is not experienced as a gift to be appreciated. It is experienced as the fulfillment of an expectation, which produces no positive valence in the relational account, because it is simply the expected state of affairs. And when the accessible person is briefly unavailable, when circumstance rather than choice produces a gap in their accessibility, the people who had integrated their baseline accessibility as an expectation do not respond with the understanding of something temporarily absent that will return. They respond with the specific discomfort of an expectation that has been violated, which is the specific discomfort of loss, which is paradoxically the first moment at which the accessible person has registered in the other person's relational attention with any significant weight. The third mechanism is the asymmetry of investment that consistent accessibility creates in relational dynamics, the specific tendency of relationships in which one person is significantly more accessible than the other two. Develop an investment asymmetry in which the less accessible person accrues the relational power, the ability to set terms, to be the one pursued rather than pursuing, to have their preferences and their availability treated as more precious simply because accessing them requires more effort and more uncertainty, while the more accessible person's constant availability signals a higher relative investment in the relationship, which communicates a lower perception of their own value in the relationship, which further reduces the less accessible person's perception of the cost of losing their presence, which further reduces the weight they assign to the more accessible person's input, needs, and perspective. The third layer addresses the specific interior architecture of a too accessible person. Why the pattern of excessive availability is not simply a behavioral habit that can be revised through the decision to be less available, but a specific psychological orientation that has its roots in deeper material about worth, belonging, and what the person believes they have to offer, and what they believe they need to provide in order to remain worth keeping. The most consistent finding in the clinical literature on people-pleasing and excessive accommodation, a finding that runs through the work of Harriet Breaker on the disease to please, through Robert Glover's framework on nice guy syndrome, through the contemporary attachment research on anxious attachment and its relationship to overgiving, is that the behavior of making oneself perpetually available is not primarily organized around a genuine desire to serve the needs of others, though genuine care is often genuinely present alongside the underlying driver. It is primarily organized around the management of a specific interior anxiety, the anxiety that if the person is not consistently providing value, consistently making themselves useful, consistently being there in the specific way that makes their absence feel like a loss to the people around them. They will discover what they most fear discovering, that their presence is not wanted for its own sake, but only for the specific function it provides, and that if they stop providing the function, they will stop being wanted. The perpetual accessibility is, at this level of analysis, not generosity. It is insurance, the specific behavioral pattern of a person who has not yet developed a relationship with their own worth that is sufficiently secure that they can tolerate the uncertainty of not being needed, of allowing the people in their lives to miss them, of withholding the function long enough to find out whether the wanting of their presence survives the withdrawal of the service. This is the specific and demanding interior work that the revision of excessive accessibility requires, not the surface behavioral adjustment of becoming less available, which without the interior work simply produces the anxiety of someone who is withholding what they believe they owe, but the genuine development of a relationship with one's own worth that does not require the continuous provision of function to maintain its stability. The specific, unhurried, deeply personal work of building the interior knowledge that you are worth wanting, independent of what you provide, that your presence itself has value that does not depend on your usefulness, that the people who are worth having in your life will continue to want you even when you are not immediately available to serve their needs. The psychological research on self-worth and its relationship to relational behavior, drawing from the work of Kristen Neff on self-compassion and its relationship to neediness and overgiving, and from the object relations theory of Winnicott on the capacity to be alone as a developmental achievement that allows genuine relating rather than anxious servicing, consistently identifies the same foundational principle. The person who is most capable of genuine intimacy is not the person who is most available, but the person who is most secure in their own worth, because the genuinely secure person gives from abundance rather than from anxiety, gives what they choose to give rather than what they fear they must provide, and is therefore genuinely, freely, authentically present when they are present, rather than compulsively, anxiously, serviceably present in the way that produces the invisibility this video is named for. The fourth layer, the one that determines what this entire understanding means for the person who recognizes themselves in it, addresses what the genuine revision of excessive accessibility looks like, what it requires, and the crucial distinction between the selective availability that actually changes the dynamic and the strategic withdrawal that produces only distance and resentment. The crucial distinction must be made clearly and held throughout. Selective availability, in the sense this video is describing, is not a technique for making yourself appear more valuable by making yourself artificially less accessible. It is not the manipulation of the people in your life through the strategic withholding of your presence. It is not the performance of a scarcity that is not genuine. It is the natural, authentic, sustainable behavioral consequence of having developed a relationship with your own interior life that is rich enough and full enough and genuinely absorbing enough that your presence in it, in your own life, in your own work, in your own developing direction, becomes the primary claim on your time and attention. And the people who want access to you find themselves wanting access to someone who is genuinely, interestingly, substantively occupied with something other than being available to them. This is the specific shift that produces the effect without the manipulation, the genuine version of what the technique attempts to produce through calculation, not the person who is withholding their presence to create the appearance of a life, but the person who is living a life and therefore has a presence that requires some navigation to access, a presence that carries the specific weight of a person who has other things to do and other places to be, a presence that is chosen when it is given rather than default when it is given. The behavioral changes that flow from this interior development are real and specific. You respond when it is genuine to respond rather than when it is reflexive to respond. You are available when you want to be rather than when you feel you should be. You allow the conversations to end the messages to go unanswered for periods that are not strategically calculated, but are simply the accurate reflection of a person who is occupied with their own life. You allow the people around you to experience the specific sensation of reaching for you, and not immediately finding you, not as a cruelty, not as a message, but as the simple, authentic reality of a person whose availability is a specific and valuable thing rather than an ambient background condition of the relationship. And what this produces, consistently, reliably, in the specific way that the scarcity principle predicts, and that the research on relational investment confirms, is the specific quality of relational attention that the always accessible person has been providing but receiving almost none of. The attention of someone who is not certain your presence will be there when they look for it, who is therefore looking for it rather than assuming it, who has been reminded by your occasional unavailability that your presence is a specific and valued thing rather than a feature of the relational furniture they have stopped noticing. The person who has built a genuine life, who has the interior depth and the exterior direction that makes them genuinely, authentically, sustainably occupied, has not become less giving. They have become more worth giving to. Their presence, when it arrives with the specific weight of something chosen, something that required something of them to provide, something that the person receiving it can feel the difference of, even if they cannot name what the difference is. And that weight, the weight of a presence that is real rather than reflexive, chosen rather than compulsive, valued by the person offering it, and therefore genuinely valuable to the person receiving. It is the specific thing that constant accessibility, however generously intended, consistently fails to provide. Here is the most important question this video is asking you to sit with. What would you be doing with your time and your attention and your presence if the management of other people's access to you were not the primary organizing principle of how you spend it? Because the answer to that question, the specific life that would emerge if you stopped organizing your availability around the implicit belief that being needed is the price of being wanted, is the life whose development would naturally produce the selective availability that this video has been describing, without the calculation, without the technique, without the strategic withholding that produces distance rather than weight. The visibility you have been missing is not produced by making yourself less available. It is produced by becoming genuinely more present in your own life, more absorbed in your own direction, more invested in your own development, more occupied by the specific work that your existence is here to do, so that the presence you offer to the people in your life is the presence of someone who has a life, who has a direction, whose time carries genuine cost because it is genuinely spoken for, and whose choice to give it to you is therefore the kind of gift that registers rather than the kind of default that disappears. This is Quiet Power. Subscribe if this video has named the specific invisibility that constant accessibility has been creating in your own relationships. Share it with one person in your life who gives everything and feels, despite the giving, overlooked, because the reframe in this video is the beginning of the only shift that actually produces the recognition that the giving alone has never been able to earn. And leave your answer in the comments. What is the specific thing in your own life that you would invest more of yourself? And if you are not organizing so much of your availability around others' access to you, until the next one, invest in your own life first. Show up with the weight of someone who chose to be there, and know that the person who is hardest to reach is always the one most worth reaching.